Thank you very much. My name is Matthias. I work at Chainalysis, and really the hardest part of Chainalysis is pronouncing the name. It's really, really difficult. Today I want to talk about the evolution of blockchain analytics, because I also am a firm believer of stablecoin rails, ruling payment systems, and the underlying bit is obviously regulation. And regulation does what? It cements in risk mitigation strategies, and blockchain analytics is a really important part of how you understand and mitigate risk on blockchains. I, for myself, well, I'm head of policy at Chainalysis. I've done some crypto-related work policy for more than 10 years on the public and private side. And Chainalysis, for those of you who don't know Chainalysis, it's a blockchain analytics company. And what that basically means is that we map on-chain transactional activity to real-world entities. And we do this for already 10 years. We're the market leaders, and we've mapped more than 100,000 different entities on-chain. So we've allocated wallet addresses to them. More than 1 billion, and it's probably already even 2. More than 1,500 different customers use our systems to understand how blockchains actually work. And these are customers from the public and from the private sector. Let me start with my key takeaways, and they will not be very surprising. The first thing is that blockchains are a complete game changer when you think about AML, risk mitigation, AML, the fight against financial crime. Because they are, well, if it's public permissionless ledgers, they really create permanent and immutable transactional data. It's transactional transparency. And if you pair that with proper analytics, advanced analytics, it can really help you to understand transactional patterns cross-border. You get much more insight, much more visibility into transactional flows that you could ever have in the fiat world. And this is the newest part, and that's what I really want to you to take back home, is that analytics started off by detecting financial crime and mapping out relationships between entities interacting. But what we are doing now is actually going beyond that into the space of preventing financial crime. So using the analytical tools to not detect crime or any sort of risk that you want to mitigate, but to actively prevent it. And in order to make you understand what blockchain analytics is all about, in the first part, I'll briefly, and we only have like 20 minutes, go through how blockchain analytics actually works, and then the evolution of it. So what is blockchain analytics? As you all know, all the transactions are recorded in an immutable ledger. But the problem is you see alphanumeric numbers, which are wallets, and you see a transactional amount, and you see a counterparty. It's really hard to understand who sits behind those entities and where this transaction or this Bitcoin, this Ethereum came before. And that's exactly what blockchain analytics helps you with. We call it the blockchain knowledge graph. It gives you an idea of who is interacting on-chain to understand these types of relationships and think about risk and risk mitigation. How do we do that? In 3 steps. We first identify real-world entities and map them. We attribute them wallet addresses. So essentially, we are tagging entities to blockchains. We do this in multiple ways. We use their infrastructure, for example, if there are illicit activities, and see how the Bitcoin moves across the custody systems. We scrape online data in the darknet, but also in the clearnet. We have got more than 100 analysts looking for wallet addresses and attributions, because each and every tag that we give inside our systems is evidence-based. So we've got evidence that this address actually belongs to that specific entity. And when it comes to fraud data, we have even installed now AI-driven tools that interact with fraudsters directly to map out their financial infrastructure even before they use it. And we can use that data to then tag specific entities to wallet addresses. And then the second part is really important. We call it clustering, because all these addresses we have are basically starting points. So once we've mapped one specific entity, we can use that information to see what other wallet addresses are controlled by the same entity. And suddenly, instead of one address, you've got millions of those addresses. To give you an example, when you think about sanctioned wallet addresses that are officially sanctioned, so you're not allowed to touch them, interact with them, there's around 1,500 wallets of those. When you use our roughly 400 heuristics, and you run them on top of those wallet addresses, you will end up with around nearly 10 million different addresses. That's how powerful you can scale the information you have on blockchain addresses. And the great thing about these types of activities is that these are all deterministic methods. So each and every address is evidence-based and can be even used as evidence in court. And we're pretty proud of that our tools and systems have been validated in a US court and have led to a conviction. So this is really important. And then the third step, this is what we will be talking about the most, is how do you use that data actually in different ways in order to get the insight that you want, right? So the first two steps, that's the base, and the third bit is the one where most of the activity and evolution happens. So to give you a practical example, when you look into a blockchain explorer, which you can do everywhere, you'll basically see the address, the balance, and so on. If you put in the same address into our systems, what you will see is that this address actually belongs to Hydra Market, a darknet market. There is more than 6 million addresses close to it, and you can see who's interacting on that specific market. You can see vendors selling, you can see buyers buying, you can see how they cash out and try to launder the money. And this is really important for multiple purposes in the private and public sector. Now, let's talk about advances in blockchain analytics. For me, it really happened in sort of like 3 different phases. The first one is transactional intelligence. Because blockchains are so transparent and we can map and understand transactional behavior, we can also look into beginning and end points of transactions, something that in the traditional financial services world you cannot do. Because a bank basically sees a transaction coming in and it sees a transaction going out. Whatever happens afterwards, they've got no clue. With blockchain analytics, you can actually see all of those transactions and have all the contextual information around it. So you can look multiple hops back, you can see relationships even between different parties. And this is an absolute game changer when it comes to financial intelligence, mapping out scamming or illicit activity networks. I often get the question, what about mixers, what about DeFi, what about bridges, what about swaps? And obviously, these are all technologies that try to essentially obfuscate the source of funds. They're trying to hinder sort of like a clear tracing line. And we see that these types of technologies are used even more. Back in 2022, for example, around 40% of illicit activity or addresses that are associated with illicit activity have gone straight into centralized exchanges, essentially to cash out, because these entities are really, really important. They are the venues to essentially convert crypto assets into fiat. Now, when you look two years later in 2024, if you look at the same metric, it's only 10% of illicit activity that goes straight into crypto asset exchanges. So there is loads of transactions before that actually happens, including mixers and DeFi bridges. So it's a way, blockchain analytics has always been and will always remain an arms race with illicit actors. In our products, for example, now you can actually trace through a certain amount of mixers directly. You don't have, it just looks like a normal transaction, because also mixers, they are based on heuristics, on algorithms, and once you understand them, you can actually also decode them. Same thing with bridges. Bridges are instruments that allow you to hop from one blockchain to another, which used to be extremely complicated in terms of like following the money, but now there's loads of automation, and as Paul said, automation is the most important part. There's loads of automation in actually enabling you to follow transactions also from one blockchain to another. I think we've mapped around like 300 million of those transactions. And how does it look like in a product? This really, instead of this long list of transactions, you can actually have a visualization of how a Bitcoin, for example, moves. And it gives you the comfort to understand what actually happens, who's interacting with a specific wallet. Each of those dots is a wallet. Black ones are empty wallets. And then here in the middle, you can see the value in US dollars. And you can really understand what happens here. The transaction went to a cross-chain bridge, so they hopped on a different blockchain, for example, Ethereum, to Bitcoin, and then back using a mixer, and then essentially they end up at an exchange. And it's really important for the exchange to understand what happens before in order to ensure that they're not converting any illicit funds and stay compliant. And this is obviously the tool that most law enforcement agencies will use, because it gives you really granular insight into what happened at the specific transaction. Companies mostly use something that we call Know Your Transaction, so transaction monitoring. Every time a crypto asset service provider gets a transaction in or sends transactions out, they can have a look at the exposure that this transaction has. So is it coming from something like a scam? Is it coming from an illicit actor? And they can then take appropriate action. For example, not accepting funds, freezing funds, or even filing suspicious transaction reports to law enforcement, who can then take up that case, investigate further in Reactor, and take appropriate action, for example, freezing, seizing, arresting. When we look a little bit further, this is sort of like the second phase, and that's something that is becoming much more common right now. The first two bits are, the bread and butter. That's how we started 10 years ago. Now, because you can see the whole network of transactions, unlike in a fiat world, you can actually change your perspective slightly. You can go from a transactional perspective to an entity perspective and think about, well, how does a specific entity on-chain interact? How do all the transactions look like that are coming into that specific entity? And where do the funds go out when an entity is interacting? And that really gives you an idea of where that entity actually sits, about the transactional volume they have, the counterparties they have, and how they react to illicit activity. We call it VASP risking, and it's most likely not something that law enforcement would use, but with MiCA coming in place and regulations around the world, supervisors really want to know how do on-chain or entities that are acting on-chain really behave. And it's not about reading policies and making sure they're rightly implemented, it's transactional data. All these transactions happened, and you understand whether or not a crypto asset service provider, for example, has got a massive exposure to sanctions entities, or is facilitating money laundering crimes. And you really focus on one specific entity. And it's also important for law enforcement to some extent, because they actually know that certain types of exchanges, and we see this so clearly, are more prone to be associated with darknet markets or money mule activity and so on. So there's a lot of specialization within the crime sector. And you can do the same thing on an asset level. So instead of looking at a specific entity, you can actually look at a specific asset, a holistic view of the entire ecosystem. So whatever token you're looking at, you can actually check and see who the biggest holders are, how often an asset has been traded. You can even see how that asset is used, and you can understand whether or not it is highly likely that a specific or what proportion of that asset is being used for illicit finance, for money laundering, for sanctions evasion. And this is extremely important, for crypto asset service providers who think about listing an asset, for example, but even more importantly when you think about stablecoins. And payments. Stablecoin issuers, well, they sort of like have an unwritten, not really obligation to monitor secondary market activities, but I think we're going more and more towards that. They really have the superpower here to understand when and how their asset, their stablecoin, is used to facilitate financial crime. And whenever they see that, they can actually then freeze or block certain stablecoins. And we work really, really closely with the big global stablecoin issuers to do exactly that. We work with stablecoin issuers, with law enforcement agencies, to surface all the illicit activity on those rails and make sure that we freeze those assets and essentially take the kill switch. So yeah, really, really, really important innovation, I think. And then thirdly, we've got new enhanced AI. We use a lot of AI already because of our clustering mechanisms. It's machine learning. You basically take a lot of data and try to find specific patterns of who's controlling which wallet. But in this case, what we are doing now is we are adding the capability to spot behavioral patterns. At the beginning, I said that each and every wallet attribution is evidence-based, which is great, but sometimes a specific address, a specific transaction might look very suspicious, but you don't have evidence, and you can't really surface that, which is bad for law enforcement, because they might be happy to just have a hint of a specific activity. For example, money laundering. Think about crimes that don't originate directly on blockchains. For example, you are buying drugs on the corner, and even these types of activities, they look just like every other transaction on chain. But what is different is the behavior afterwards. And once you figure out the specific behavior that is pertinent in very specific types of crimes, you can look out for these behaviors and then say to a certain extent or a certain degree of confidence whether or not it is likely that a specific behavior, for example, amounts to money laundering, amounts to money mules, amounts to wash trading. And we call it signals, and it is really enhancing the way we look at blockchains, because it gives you this second set of data where we give you a confidence interval and a confidence interval into that specific data set without actually having the 100% truth that we always want. So that's something that we call signals, and this is really important for law enforcement because they might be able to look at that suspicious behavior and then essentially add other type of information to make their case. But we're also using it for different things because that's sort of like the pinnacle of blockchain analytics. We really call it. We call it data solutions, and the most important thing about this program here is that it is something completely different than what we've done ever before. Previously, we had specific products with a specific purpose, investigations, transaction monitoring, counterparty due diligence on assets and even counterparties. This here is a highly customizable solution that allows you to essentially query all the data that we have in the way you want. You can surface each and every type of information that you're looking for. And as I said before, you can look for specific typologies of scams, for example. You can look at money mule activity, and you can also look for malicious smart contracts, for example. We've seen in the past, and if you haven't already seen it, there is a really good report out, the Crypto Crime Report 2025, that gives you an overview of the criminal landscape, the way we are seeing it. And one of the things that is surfaced there is that first, like, crypto crime is rising more generally. We have got peak highs. And the second thing is that the ecosystem is getting much more diversified and much more technically sophisticated. Approval phishing scams, for example, have risen 200% in the last year. And this is here part of the answer, because you can really look into specific smart contract details and how this works. So basically, what I'm trying to say is each and every sophisticated technological crime leaves fingerprints, just like a transaction itself. So what we said is, well, if we can understand these digital footprints, these digital signatures, then we can probably actually use them for our advantage, right? Because leaving fingerprints is a great thing if you want to detect something. And we worked on a method to proactively identify further scammers. We've done Operation Spincaster with 19 public authorities, 18 crypto exchanges, and essentially the idea was to target one specific crypto crime that, as I said before, 200% increase last year. It's approval phishing. And essentially what approval phishing does is it tricks the victim into signing a smart contract that allows the attacker to basically drain funds from that specific wallet. So you think you're signing an airdrop, but what you actually do is you give access to your wallet and then all your funds are moved. And this is something that is very, very cheap to deploy. And you can buy it in every darknet market, so to speak, and most scammers do that. I mean, they are also to that extent, lazy. If something works, they will repeat it. So they buy the same smart contract for approval phishing. They send it to as many addresses they can, and just hope that someone clicks on OK and they withdraw funds. We've now partnered with exchanges and with law enforcement. We need to partner with law enforcement because they are the ones who can essentially give authority for freezing assets, for stopping transactions to go out from crypto asset service providers. So we also need those crypto service providers to be part of that sort of like fight scamming environment. And we also need stablecoin issuers because these are the ones who've got the superpower to essentially, turn off electronic money, so to speak, and burn all the tokens that they consider to be used illicitly. How does that look in practice? We identified nearly 190 million in losses. And just to give you like a rough idea of how this works. So once you have got your digital fingerprint, you know that a specific scam has been deployed, and you've got one victim, you can actually look at the metadata of a smart contract. And that's how it would look like on a normal Explorer. Here, there is something that is like really awkward. This is essentially the value that maximally can be withdrawn from that contract. That's quite a lot, I would say. That's not typically what you would find in a smart contract. You can then also look at at the topic here, which essentially tells you that the event is an approval to spend your crypto. This can have legitimate use cases, but most of it is scam. And then you can also look at the spender address. And now with the newest and most modern technology, you can look for this metadata and essentially look for other wallets who have been infected by that specific smart contract. And by doing so, you can then go to exchanges and say, wallet X has been is pretty close to signing an approval phishing attack. Please tell your client to stop. Or please, hold those funds back. And that's essentially what we have done. We discovered digital fingerprints, we defined search parameters, and then basically automated all of these processes in order to find further victims before they actually have been scammed. And so you can stop the transaction from happening in the first place. Yeah. There's like 100,000 different ways of using that, but I just wanted to give you one specific example. So yeah, coming back, public blockchains really create a permanent, immutable ledger that can be used with the right tools, with the right analytical tools to really effectively investigate and understand counterparty risk, AML risk extremely efficiently. And because we are improving basically day by day, we are slowly moving into the area of fraud prevention rather than just fraud detection. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me. We have time for 2 questions, I believe. Okay, cool. I've got 2 questions.
Yeah, so I'm having trouble getting past that picture, the reactor picture, where you track like the money through a particular wallet. And I've got 2 questions for you. Like, I guess I'm a little skeptical of like, how is it that possible, right? Given that these things are mixers. And then secondly, basically one of the things that seems to be emerging is people are promising like a lot of on-chain privacy. And with a couple of notable exceptions like Nightfall and Aztec, these are not like full on-chain privacy solutions. They look like sort of supercharged mixers. So are you going to be able to basically do the same thing with all of these so-called on-chain privacy solutions that are coming to the market?
I mean, on-chain privacy solutions, there's multiple ways and multiple different types of on-chain privacy models. I think they will change the way that analytics work. But typically, what happens is you've got your layer 1, you've got your Ethereum layer, for example, and then you've got a second layer, a layer 2 solution, where there is enhanced privacy because that's where you can actually design your environment the way you want, as a developer. And I think from our perspective, the first part is that we will be focusing on the endpoints and the entry points. So making sure that we know what is actually going in and what is actually going out.
That works great when people put money in.
Yeah.
Right? If you have systems like Aztec or Nightfall,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. From a traditional perspective, it becomes a black box to us, just like every crypto asset service provider, which is why you always track until the first, mixer, cryptocurrency, crypto asset service provider, because everything that happens off-chain, is invisible to us. And in this case, this is also one step away from like a layer 2 protocol can be one step away from layer 1. So what we've seen already is with the Canton network, for example, that there is something like a partnership where under certain circumstances, there is a possibility to actually then trace within the layer 2 protocol. So I think we'll find some balance of like on-chain transparency and privacy with those types of services. But they are different to standard layer 1, that's for sure.